We're live.
Hello, welcome to another edition of Socialist Action webcasts. My name is Elizabeth Weiss, and I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, past Secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. I'm speaking to you this evening from Newfoundland and Labrador. That includes the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq, and the island of Newfoundland and Inuit and Innu, the original people of Labrador. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is Election 2021, Results and Prospects. Our panelists will be Leah Gazan, Barry Weisleder, Steve McQuillan, and Chris Thompson. Each speaker or panelist will speak for about 10 minutes. After that, we will take questions written into the chat column from the online audience. So let's begin. Leah was first elected to represent Winnipeg Centre in the House of Commons in 2019. She was born in Thompson, Manitoba. Her mother, Marjorie, is Lakota Chinese. Her father, Albert, is a Holocaust survivor from the Netherlands. Both of her parents were organizers for the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. She served as president for the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg. Leah participated in Idle No More and represented the province of Manitoba for the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, advocating for acknowledgements of injustice against Indigenous Canadian adopted children. So welcome, Leah.
Thank you so much for having me here today for your very important webcast. As you all know, we just finished an election. I was happy to be re-elected the Member of Parliament of Winnipeg Centre as the Member of Parliament, located on Treaty 1 territory, ancestral lands of the Dakota, Dene, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Cree peoples, and homelands of the Métis Nation, which I speak to you from today. And just to discuss some of the election results, I was one of the fortunate 25 that won their seat being re-elected. Last election, I took out the Liberal MP, Robert Falcon-Ouellette, regaining back Winnipeg Centre, which has historically been an NDP riding. It's the home of J.S. Woodsworth. It is the home of the Winnipeg Strike. It's a riding that's rich with progressive history, rich in movement building, and that kind of spirit is persistent in the riding of Winnipeg Centre. So I can't tell you how privileged I am, how honored I am to be re-elected by a community that I love, a community that I respect, a community that has struggles, no doubt, as the third poorest riding in the country, but a community also rich with resiliency and strength. You know, much of what's happened that we witnessed before and during the election impacted the good people of Winnipeg Centre, whether it's the climate emergency, whether it's the housing crisis, whether it's the fact that many families, refugee families in this country, do not benefit from things like a child tax benefit, you know, sinking people deep in poverty. We have been noted by then Liberal Minister Caroline Bennett as ground zero on the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. We certainly have our share of struggles, but in face of those struggles, we have great resiliency and strength, and we continue to rise to the occasion, fighting for the good people of Winnipeg Centre, for the country, and for peoples around the world, a strong history of pacifism, a strong history of peace advocacy. And as a descendant of somebody who was a peace activist who lost a job in the 60s for wearing a peace button, I'm very proud to keep that history and that movement alive today. Certainly, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone. The election results for the New Democratic Party of Canada really staying where we were at prior to the election, gaining one seat. An election that I would call a totally unnecessary election, particularly as we see the results of this election with the Liberals pretty much being where they were at, the Conservatives, and certainly the New Democrat. I was fortunate to win by a huge margin. I actually won my riding with 50% of the vote. That's a very strong mandate. And I think part of it is that, related to the progressive mandate upon which myself, the team, and our community of Winnipeg supported it, a platform rooted in climate justice, bold climate action. I think it's no secret where I've stood around, LNG pipeline, and the ongoing human rights violations that are being perpetrated in real time against the Wet'suwet'en peoples, the need to cancel TMX pipeline, the need to stop the cutting down of the old growth forest, 3% left, very clear positions on climate, and very clear positions around fighting for a guaranteed livable basic income. We know that people around this country are living in poverty while corporations get richer. People are struggling more and more. And we have income guarantees in this country. For example, GIS is an income guarantee, I would argue, not livable. EI, another income guarantee, not livable. EIA, social assistance, grossly unlivable. Fighting for a guaranteed livable basic income, something that would make a difference in my community. A community, as I indicated, is the third poorest riding in the country. I think it's time that we push forward a progressive, bold agenda. Our very survival depends on it, whether it, relates to the climate emergency. We saw months and months of wildfires, growing inequality that resulted in a loss of life. There's no more violent human rights violations than keeping people poor. I think poverty, institutionalized poverty and inequality, is the most vile and violent human rights violations targeted primarily to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as we witnessed during the pandemic, where migrant workers were placed in cramped quarters, living off food rations, in living conditions that were not conducive or safe to keep people safe during COVID-19, and the ongoing frontline struggles with Indigenous peoples in terms of fighting to uphold minimum human rights to land, water, and resources, to access clean drinking water, affordable housing. That certainly, I thought, was totally overlooked during the election, and certainly the critical crisis, the ongoing crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in this country, something that barely got any attention during the election. People on the front lines of these crises were really a backbench, to many other issues that were put forward in the election, and we cannot move forward and not look at these critical issues. And I think people residing in Canada want attention to it. It's no secret. Some of the top priority issues for me at the door was, for example, the support that people had for a guaranteed livable basic income for those who did not have it. The fact that people expect those who are elected to take real action to mitigate the climate emergency. The fact that people are no longer satisfied to pick and choose when to uphold human rights or climate justice when it suits the economic and political interests of the day, that we have a responsibility for the survivor of all life to fight against a growing corporate dictatorship and the violation constantly perpetrated against lands, in people, and people in support of corporate greed. You know, we did hear a lot about a wealth tax, but who benefits from that wealth tax? We need to have discussions about a fairer tax system, which I think the NDP did very well, but who is going to benefit? And what is it going to look like going forward to change lives? What kind of programs are we going to fund? And so, you know, like I said, you know, we certainly were hoping that we would gain more seats during the election. It did not happen. And I'm hoping that now that the election is over, that we will have time to step back and reflect on what has occurred and maybe take some courageous positions. Maybe it's time that we take courageous positions. You know, when I ran on 4 key bottom lines. Is what you're asking me to do, will it meet climate targets? Does it honor human rights? Does it honor Indigenous rights? And are you asking me to break the rule of law? It's time in this country that be the measuring ground of all decisions being made about things that we support and things that we don't. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you very much for having me on the panel tonight.
Thank you, Leah. Our next speaker is Barry Weisleder. He's a teacher, writer, editor, and union organizer. He's the chair of the NDP Socialist Caucus and a former executive board member of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. He is the political producer of the webcast series, which began in March 2020, a co-editor of Turn Left magazine, and federal secretary, Socialist Action. Welcome, Barry.
Good evening, comrades and friends. I'm pleased to be speaking to you from the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people in a place called Tacarento. Some people call it Toronto. To quote Yogi Berra, it's deja vu all over again. The 2021 federal election, which Justin Trudeau called just to gain the majority of seats, looks much like the election result in 2019. The same parties are in place, each with nearly the same number of MPs as before. But something has changed. All the leaders are skating on thin ice. A couple of them will soon be forced to resign. And Justin Trudeau is considerably weakened as Prime Minister. With zero appetite for another election, the Liberal minority government will have to lean heavily on the Labour-based New Democratic Party to pass legislation. That means working class organizations will have a great opportunity to extract concessions from the ruling class. The reason that the big business class hates minority government is precisely that. It hates to concede anything to labor and the working class. That's why Trudeau abandoned proportional representation in 2015. Bay Street doesn't want PR, and Justin prefers not to share power, even if it is with a bunch of pro-capitalist labor officials. So that's the first point. Prospect of a labor offensive to make gains. The offensive should start with childcare, farmer care, long-term care, Indigenous restitution, green energy, social housing, and a break with imperialism, the arms industry, and military intervention. The second point is leadership. That is, the need for a radical change of leadership of labor is to go forward. The question is posed, what went wrong, Jagmeet? How is it that with more than twice the election budget, $24 million, and a collapsing Green Party and polls showing Singh as the most liked political leader, the NDP gained only 1% more votes and just 1 extra seat in this election? Singh blames the low turnout and the lack of polling stations at universities during a snap election in the midst of a pandemic. It's true. Overall, voter turnout was 59%, some 8% lower than in 2019 and the lowest it's been since 2008. But another big factor was at work. There was nothing to inspire a large turnout. No major party offered an alternative to a system in crisis. Across Canada, up to the middle of September, 1.6 million fell ill with COVID-19 and 27,500 died. Thousands died at for-profit long-term care centers. Vaccines, very slow to be administered, had to be imported because a past Tory government sold the publicly owned Connaught Labs, and no domestic pharmaceutical firm produces the needed vaccines. The fourth wave of COVID is now surging continentally and globally. Bourgeois media coverage of the election campaign focused on the major party leaders. Personality politics always detract from issues and completely obscure the context of a failed system. Half of North America was on fire. Floods and flames ravaged Europe and other continents. Workers in their millions face rising inflation, curtailed benefits, and the threat of homelessness. The situation cries out for systemic solutions. Sadly, all the major parties are committed to the preservation of capitalism. All favor a carbon tax on consumers rather than expropriation and retooling of the big producers, especially big oil and gas. All would tinker with assistance to home buyers rather than take control of land development and the construction industry to build millions of homes and to seize empty units for those in desperate need. Some decried big bank and telecom super profits, but none demanded expropriate the expropriators. All talk about reconciliation with Indigenous people, pledge a pittance to discover more unmarked graves, but stop short of demanding the churches pay for their crimes, much less insist on seizing the assets of giant resource corporations so that First Nations can gain clean water, quality healthcare and education, and exercise self-determination. The result is a biosphere teetering on the brink of disaster. Austerity conditions are worsened by unemployment, underemployment, and precarious part-time work at minimum wage and no benefits. Public Medicare is debilitated by long wait times, no dental care, no vision care, pharmacare, emotional and mental health care, all lacking. Indigenous Canadians are subjected to shameful levels of unemployment, poor housing, healthcare, addiction support, and child support. Meanwhile, giant corporations plunder their resources and operate roads and pipelines through their lands with heavily armed police at the ready. Cuts to benefits paid to the most vulnerable and victimized people under Canadian capitalism are the norm. In Canada, the Conservatives aped the US Republicans, trying to limit women's reproductive rights, tolerating racist and Islamophobic attacks on immigration, and brazen attacks on workers' rights, jobs, wages, and benefits, even the right to organize a union. The Tories openly encourage and subsidize carbon polluters. They pledged to punish pipeline protesters more severely. When Aaron O'Toole said he would balance the budget, we know on whose backs he would do that. While the racist People's Party of Canada won no seats, it increased its vote to 5.2% by becoming the voice of the anti-vax minority. Liberals profess to be more progressive than the Tories, but the Liberal Party ordered the postal workers back to work, broke their strike in November 2018, broke the strike of the Montreal dock workers in May 2021, spent $4.5 billion of workers' tax money to buy the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and shipped armored vehicles to the disgusting Saudi regime to be used to commit genocide in Yemen and to repress the Saudi people. The Liberal Prime Minister was caught promoting deferred prosecution for corrupt SNC Lavalin. He spent over $100 billion in the form of the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, much of it going into the pockets of wealthy business owners. His appointment of Inuk leader Mary Simon as Canada's 30th Governor General changed nothing. Most of the 94 Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action remain ignored by Ottawa. Trudeau got the House of Commons to approve a resolution to prop up Israeli apartheid against the oppressed Palestinian people by falsely conflating criticism of the State of Israel with anti-Semitism. His then Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, played a leading role in the failed effort to install by force a puppet of the United States as president of Venezuela. The illegal and brutal sanctions imposed on the Venezuelan people caused great hardship and some 40,000 deaths up to 2020. Now, Lima has quit the Lima Group, and the US is defeated and retreated from Afghanistan. On a per capita basis, Canada is tied with the United States for third worst polluter in the world, behind only Saudi Arabia and Australia. Canadian imperialism is heavily concentrated in mining, including the massive tar sands in Alberta. Canadian mine owners like Barrick Gold, Suncor, Potash Corporation, Gold Corp, Teck Resources, and Cameco exploit resources for the sole benefit of their wealthy shareholders, subsidized heavily by our tax dollars and leaving heavy pollution behind them. They operate all over the third world, reaping huge profits by paying low wages, denying basic rights and safety to workers, violating the rights of Indigenous people everywhere and using mercenaries to even kill small miners who were trying to eke out an existence with handheld tools. Justin Trudeau has done nothing but support the Canadian corporate mining giants. The Green Party program is entirely within the framework of the capitalist system. Founded by prominent former Tories and Liberals, the Green Party is a diversion for the millions of Canadians awakening to the unfolding climate catastrophe. Destructive climate change cannot be uprooted by the so-called free market. Capitalism generates profit by any means necessary. The greatest causes of carbon pollution, the burning of fossil fuel and the waging of wars to plunder resources, are core elements of capitalism. By accepting the horrific exigencies of private enterprise, the Green Party renders itself irrelevant. Its leader, Annamie Paul, is anti-choice, pro-big business, and pro-NATO. She surrounded her autocratic self with arch-Zionist advisors who falsely accused 2 of her MPs of being anti-Semitic. Crisis ensued, crippling the Greens. Its votes sank from 6 to 2%, with Annamie Paul running a distant fourth in Toronto Centre. She is finished as a leader, and the Green win in Kitchener, Ontario, was a fluke, resulting from the removal of the local Liberal candidate at the last minute. The NDP, a party based on the working class institutions, with trade unions represented directly at NDP conventions, is the only mass working class party. For this reason, Socialist Action gives the NDP critical support in elections. At the same time, we oppose its right-wing, pro-capitalist, undemocratic leadership. More undemocratic than ever, the NDP brass increasingly hand-picks candidates without holding a local nomination meeting, often to exclude socialist contenders, and spends most of the money on the leader's tour and TV ads. The leader failed to draw the lessons of Canadian imperialist crimes in Afghanistan, Libya, and Haiti. He is loyal to NATO, silent on Venezuela, condones the Zionist apartheid state, and is for a more rabidly anti-China policy. Jagmeet Singh spars with Justin Trudeau over housing prices, but has no effective plan to spur housing supply. Singh's demand for a 1% tax on the super rich wouldn't fund national childcare, let alone generate mass social housing, free post-secondary education, or an all-service Medicare system, including free medical drugs. He would cut subsidies to the oil industry, but not to the military budget. Singh's vain attempt to turn his personal likability into votes clearly didn't work. In any case, a popularity contest such as the one Trudeau won 6 years ago provides no basis for meaningful change. Sadly, the NDP leadership is dogmatically devoted to minor reform of a system now in its death throes. Sad also is the fact that some workers, misled by Labour leaders like the president of Unifor, are still fooled by the old siren song that urges a vote for the Liberals in order to stop the Tories. Both the Liberal and Conservative parties are tools of Bay Street, equally culpable for leading Canada and the world to more wars, greater inequality, and eco-disaster. We propose a socialist program to mobilize working people and our natural allies in a series of mass struggles aimed at challenging the capitalist system and ultimately overthrowing the polluters, exploiters, and oppressors and their racist, sexist system in favor of a workers' government. A workers' government could expropriate the great resources and productive apparatus now owned privately by a few wealthy families. A workers' government, in alliance with workers worldwide, could build a new state, a worker state, with a socially owned and democratically planned economy. A worker state can open the road to socialism. That is our goal. Today, there is no mass socialist party that can pose as a mass alternative to the NDP, and it is counterproductive to support tiny reformist nationalist parties on the Canadian left. So, our transitional slogan remains: vote NDP and fight for socialist policies. Inseparable from this slogan is the effort to build the NDP Socialist Caucus and the Workers' Action Movement inside the unions. A class struggle left wing in the unions and in the NDP paves the way to a workers' government. And on that journey, we invite you to join us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Barry. Okay, so we're going to have a switch in speakers for personal reason, but Sean will be back with us for the fourth speaker, and we will now call on Chris Thompson, who was the former New Brunswick NDP interim leader and a longtime activist in his own right. He is a leading member of SA and the steering committee of SC. Welcome, Chris.
Hi. Yeah, I very much agree with what the speakers before me have said, both Leah and Barry Weisleder. I feel that during this election, a lot of people were burnt out. Here in New Brunswick, it's the 5th election we've had in 4 years. That shows in turnout numbers. That shows in just the small amounts of debates, the small amount of real media time given to this election. I very vividly recall, in particularly the 2011 and 2015 elections, and those seemed like defining moments in Canadian political history. And the past 2 elections, particularly this one, hasn't seemed that way. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? And Barry really hit the nail on the head. We have a system in crisis, and the major political parties were not, for the most part, offering serious solutions to the issues we face. And the major issue has to do with economics as well as social justice issues. We heard before the federal election what a big issue Indigenous issues were for many Canadians. And then election time rolls around, and it seems that every major political party leader was more interested in giving lip service to the issue than providing a real way forward. But that doesn't mean that we're completely lost. There are rays of hope. There's people within the NDP, and I dare say rarely, but occasionally even in other parties who can show some light at the end of the tunnel. Personally, I was quite disappointed by the in every political party in some way. I feel the Greens were obviously at odds with themselves. They had a huge amount of progressives enter the party, and they were completely shut out by a more right-wing leader than ever. The NDP, while occasionally its messaging was good, it seemed to fail to tackle the core issues that so many Canadians are worried about. Really, how are they going to make ends meet? How are people going to deal with the turmoil in the history of our country? And I personally, I believe that the message we have to send is a stronger progressive left-wing message. And we see that here in New Brunswick. In the federal election, we gained more than most other jurisdictions for the NDP in Canada. And we really pushed a left-wing message, and we pushed socialist candidates. With the other parties, I saw nothing of interest during the Liberals, and I don't see much reason to comment on them. I think there are reasons for the election, and their electioneering was pretty transparent. But I must say something we haven't spoken on, and this will really identify the need for the left in Canada, is the fear of the fear of the right-wing parties. And I do say that as someone who lives in New Brunswick, where we're occasionally more susceptible to right-wing fear-mongering than other provinces. I'm scared by the increased visibility, the increased popular vote of the People's Party of Canada, and I'm even more scared by the Conservatives Party lies towards workers. We've seen, as far as I'm aware in my young life, the biggest shift towards the center, as much as a joke as that is, from the Conservative Party of Canada, at least in the rhetoric. And parties like the NDP, parties like the Green Party to an extent, need to make sure that they step up. They need to make sure they provide real solutions to working class Canadians. Otherwise, we simply don't have a shot. We've seen south of the border that if you don't provide real solutions to people, they can go to right-wing and neo-fascist political parties. So what does that mean in real policy? For us, in real policy, that means we need to embrace nationalization of heavy industry. It means we need to embrace a much more aggressive childcare plan, much more aggressive housing plans, much more aggressive reconciliation plans, to make sure that people can make ends meet, and that our country, a country with many other nations inside of it, is able to be okay with who it is, and the other nations inside it can work in collaboration with us, so we can be many nations moving forward. So I do have a lot of hope and a lot of faith. I joined politics 1 year ago, and I've like to think that I like to think that it's been more successful than I thought. However, that can't be done without people who are watching right now continuing to push forward, continuing to make every effort, even if there's people who you thought were your allies or whatever, who've turned their back on you, even if the political party wherever you are is more disorganized than you want it to be. You have to stick with it, because you can make a real difference. And even if you're going through what seems like meaningless elections or meaningless effort, I promise you the end result can be worthwhile, as long as we continue to push real policies and we don't and leftists don't drop their integrity at the risk of being outflanked in rhetoric by, I dare say it, even the Conservative Party of Canada. Will be able to make a real difference. I'd like to echo some of what Barry said as well, in that we need to find a way for leftists and Labour and even the party brass in the NDP to work together better, because we need, at the end of the day, the leftists in the NDP we're a ways away from booting out any party brass, and we want to see working class candidates elected. We would want to see more than 25 candidates elected. So we need to find a way to work with them, and they need to find a way to not sideline us at the expense of their own campaign. I've recently heard the story of Jessa McLean, who was the runner-up candidate for president of the NDP, secured more than 30% of the vote, who, because she challenged the party brass, now they are going against their own party rules and simply saying that she doesn't get to run as a candidate. So these are problems we're going to have to solve internally within the NDP, and I believe that they can be solved. But so long as the grassroots activists don't get discouraged, and make sure that we do our very best. I believe that's about all I have. I really want to encourage the importance of a real left-wing alternative, because as capitalism becomes more and more late stage, people need solutions to problems. And if the only parties providing these solutions to problems are right-wing and neo-fascist parties, then those are the only solutions people will feel comfortable voting for. I have no doubt that the NDP will strengthen as a party of the working class, provided the grassroots activists strengthen their convictions to make sure that the party stands up for itself. So thank you for having me on the webcast, and I look forward to answering any questions in the future.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so now we're going to go back to Sean McQuillan, and it looks like we have a younger panelist as well. Okay, so Ashant was the NDP candidate in Vancouver South, He is a Cree Métis labor activist, originally from Alberta. He works in film, theater, and voiceover, though primarily as an actor and in the art department, with some experience directing. So welcome, Sean.
Hi, thanks a lot for having me. Sorry, I'm going to have my two kids off screen, one on in my arm and one off here while I'm doing this. So to kind of break down a bit of the stuff from the election just now, I think we do need to probably talk about some of the things that were gained. I noticed Barry talked about a lot of the existing issues that have already come through, and Leah and I align very closely in our beliefs on how to do a lot of people first supports so that we can properly, yes, Kiva, so we can properly lift people up, obviously. But I do think there were some things that were to be gained over this election. The NDP came place in second in areas they never have before. I know in my riding, historically, they've not done second place, and they did. It's no longer a liberal conservative swing riding. It is a liberal NDP riding. And I think that is to be noted. You've had a lot of grassroots campaigns like Anjali's in Vancouver Granville, who she came out of nowhere. And right now, I think it's still technically too close to call, but unfortunately, I believe she's behind by a couple hundred votes at this point. She came out of nowhere as a climate activist and showed up with 300 people. Now, I don't know how many people have experience with their local riding associations, but we built from essentially 3 people in mine a few years back to 30, and that was difficult. Oh, no, here we go. That's okay, kiddo. Sorry. That's impressive to come with that kind of people. And so this is why I think it's important that what we do is we connect ourselves to grassroots movements, things that are important, and bring the people with us to make change in government. And that's going to require a lot of people connecting with different subjects and pushing towards it. Now, with the election, I will agree with Barry that a lot of the things are not going to be addressed in this next sitting of Parliament, but I want to look into different ways to allow them to be addressed. Housing, for example, is not a supply and demand issue, and everyone's policy is based around building more supply. But it's like a concert. If scalpers buy up all the tickets, it doesn't matter how many tickets you produce, you're still going to end up paying higher prices. So how we view and distribute housing has to change. Housing needs to cost no more than 25% of your income. And that's not a reality for most people, especially in any major city. So how we distribute and make sure that housing is attached to things like that, I think is the step forward. Because just saying we're going to build more for the sake of building more, everyone except the unhoused are currently living in a house. We have a distribution problem. We do not have a housing problem per se, except for getting more people in from other countries. We need to make sure that alongside building new housing, what we need to do is make sure the housing is attached to income. It currently isn't. Yes. Sorry. And I think there's a lot of issues that, I'm afraid aren't going to be solved in the next sitting of Parliament, particularly if it's going to be, another 2 years. Everyone said anything they could to get, people to vote for him during campaign time, but 2 years is a very short period of time. And I don't see things like, actual climate action coming into place. And when the IPCC report says that we're going to have a 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius increase by 2050, all of our net zero by 2050 goals are not soon enough. And also how we even calculate our emissions isn't accurate. We don't calculate our emissions of exported fossil fuels. We don't, we pay other countries to do offsets so that we can continue increasing our emissions. So the entire way it's even viewed and publicized to the public is incorrect. So that kind of education so that we actually do a real decrease in emissions is important, because right now we are still increasing emissions. And the fact that we're saying because we're doing a bit of creative accounting on our ledgers, it's not accurate to what's really going on. And as I'm carrying my kids here, we have all these announcements for childcare, but 1 in 4 Canadians work shift work. They work outside of 9 to 5 working hours. And all of this money being announced for $10 a day childcare doesn't do anything for people working outside of 9 to 5. So if you work in a non-institutionalized workplace, you do not have work options for childcare. I know, kiddo. And so I work in the film industry. I work 12-hour days, and this is how we figured this out. So my wife and I created a nonprofit where we're building childcare options for people outside of 9 to 5, changing legislation so that you can have 24 hours of care, and creating integrated childcare so you can see your children at work, because work should be a family affair. And I think there's not enough focus on that. And it's just about, let's lower the cost, and not about, the actual infrastructure that's needed. So with housing and childcare, obviously very important to me, it's something with this short sitting of government that's coming along that we need to really start being bolder in our pathways. A lot of the platforms that we saw, they weren't that different. Everyone's housing platform generally sounded the same. Everyone's, basic medical coverage stuff, aside from pharmacare and dental care, which the NDP were, of course, pushing for. It's really creating that full universal coverage. Any kind of means testing, any kind of means testing program doesn't seem to work because it doesn't provide enough supports. And obviously, one of the only things that I think the NDP were doing that no one else does was focusing on solving the drug crisis through decriminalization. And, when we've got 25 people a day in British Columbia dying, that's something that we need to make sure that we really, really focus on. I think there were a lot of gains, and I think a lot of people in this are wanting more progressive action coming through. And I think this election, although obviously nothing really came of the result that they wanted, I think it has been showing that there is desire for it, and that what we really need to do is to organize people. And that is where our greatest weakness is right now. And so right now, I'm going to continue acting like we're in election for the next 2 years, and keep working with people to, make change in the community, and continue working on all the projects that are important, regardless of whether or not sitting in government. And so I'm actually just going to yield my time there, because I need to mute for a little bit of feeding.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. All right, so now we're going to go to Kurt, our producer, and we're going to put 3 questions in the chat. So go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry, Kurt.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So our first question comes from Demand Better Canada, who asks, how can we convince the NDP to start taking FPTP to our advantage by working with the Greens? We can signal to progressives to strategically vote for the left more easily if one endorses the other. Judy Kosh asks, why is the Green Party a capitalist party and the NDP a bourgeois workers' party? And John Wunderlich asks, one basic electoral question is how much of the electoral apathy of the working class and the anger behind the PPC vote could be captured by a party that is explicitly anti-capitalist?
Okay, so we're going to go to our panelists, and I should have told our listeners earlier, but unfortunately, Leah had to leave. So we have our 3 panelists now, and they will get up to 5 minutes each to answer these 3 questions, if they wish. And we will start with Chris, then Barry, then Sean.
All right, so I'll just go down the list as Kurt said them. So Demand Better Canada, how can we convince the NDP to start taking first past the post to our advantage by working with the Greens? We can signal to progressives to strategically vote for the left more easily if one endorses the other. Here in New Brunswick, I certainly know what you mean. The Greens do much better here in New Brunswick than they do in most other places in the country. And while the NDP, we had a really good election here in New Brunswick in the last federal election, we still have a ways to go. So I definitely understand the desire to work with the Green Party and use first past the post to our advantage. I'm not sure of the actual feasibility of that. I'm not sure how, if the 2 parties would ever be able to communicate on that level to form some sort of deal or a merger or anything like that. I think there are some very big competing interests just having 2 political parties as structure, but I also don't think the NDP needs to do it. We saw in the last election, the Greens got just over 2% of the vote. And when at the same time, about 40% of people didn't vote. I would say that's a more important things to strategically look at than, quite frankly, taking votes from any other party. And so you have to start asking yourself, why are people not voting? How do you get them to vote? So that you can win in first past the post, and you can then change the system to something that benefits all Canadians more by being actually more representative of their viewpoints. So those would be a lot of the policies we've talked about already, but that would be my answer to that question. While I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of working together with the Green Party, provided we don't actually sacrifice any of our convictions, I don't think it's actually necessary. I think it's much more important on working on giving people a reason to vote and getting them out to vote. I'll move on to the next question. Why is the Green Party a capitalist party and the NDP a bourgeois workers' party? So if I would reframe that as, because both parties are proponents of capitalism, they're both capitalist parties. But the reason why the NDP is also considered a workers' party is because they simply have workers right in the constitution of the party, and there's labor at convention, and they are built up from organized labor, which is obviously an outstanding feature of the party, and it wouldn't be as progressive as it is. I know lots of us want to see it to be more progressive, but it wouldn't be as progressive as it is without that. The Green Party doesn't have that, so it's hard to call them a workers' party, although I would gather that the Green Party probably has a higher percentage of its membership from the working class than, say, the Conservative or Liberal Party, but that's just an estimate. The final question from John Wunderlich, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, is how much of the electoral apathy of the working class and of the anger behind the PPC vote could be captured by a party that is explicitly anti-capitalist? Now, there's what I'm talking about. That is the goal. What you need to do is you need to provide people with anti-capitalist solutions to problems, because those are the solutions that actually solve problems. Housing cooperatives, government control over major industry to deal with the climate crisis. Those are going to be the types of programs that actually give people a different option in much the same way that Medicare did half a century ago. So, more than that, Jesus, it's been a while. So as long as we are putting forward the actual solutions and promoting them, we'll be okay. The problem is that the structure of the country, and I certainly don't blame the NDP for this, is the structure of the country is such that every party is lobbied to be more pro-capitalist than they want to be. Every party is lobbied to stand up for the state, and that's just the nature of our country. So what we need to do as activists is we can both work within the system as people want to change it, and we can also work outside of it in non-political organizations to provide more radical change. I think answering the problem of voter apathy and voter anger and people who don't like politicians at all is more important than taking the vote away from other parties. So I'll wrap up right there at the end of the third question.
Thank you, Barry. You're muted.
There, now you can hear me, I hope. So terrific questions. Let's take a look at each of them. How can we use the first past the post electoral system to our benefit? Well, I don't think we really can. That's why we need to replace it with proportional representation. But in the meantime, what we need to do is strengthen working class parties. And there's only one mass working class party in Canada and in North America for that matter, and that's the labor-based NDP. So can we work with the Greens? Well, we could work with the Greens conceivably to stop a pipeline, to raise the minimum wage. That is, if they supported it, because the Greens in BC don't support that. They don't even support making it easier to form a union. But where there can be agreement on Indigenous rights, where there can be agreement on foreign affairs, like hands off Venezuela, well, you're going to have to change the leader of the Green Party to get that one. Then we could work together on those single issues. But in terms of an agreement to stand only one candidate of one of the NDP or the Greens in each constituency, no, that would be a bad idea. Because, you know, the Green Party is a capitalist party. And this brings me to the second question. And what makes it a capitalist party? Well, first of all, it has no organic links to the labor movement. That's one. And secondly, it has strong pro-capitalist policies. And there are only 2 or 3 exceptions to its right-wing policy book. And those policies were violated, ignored, set aside by the leader of the Green Party now and before, Elizabeth May. The Green Party was founded by disgruntled Tories and Liberals, whereas the NDP was formed by a merger of the Canadian Labour Congress and the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, both working class institutions, both coming out of the struggles of workers and farmers, both either social democratic or left social democratic, including many Marxists in their ranks. So that's what makes the NDP a workers' party, because of its organic connection to working class organizations, particularly the unions, but also some cooperatives. And because of its historical connection, the fact that its members, its organizers have been on the picket lines and have been fighting for the interests of working people. So, you know, to the extent that an alliance with the Green Party, and here would be a case of the tail wagging the dog, because the Greens are now reduced, as Chris said correctly, to less than 2% of the vote. An alliance with the Green Party would only drag the NDP further to the right. And frankly, the Jagmeet Singh leadership doesn't need any help in that regard. The Thomas Mulcair leadership didn't need any help in that regard, in its advocacy of a balanced budget, which would have meant cutbacks. So you know, we're strongly opposed to that notion. The best thing the Green Party can do is disappear. And what I say to my great friend Dimitri Lascaris, who is close to Socialist Action but ran for the leadership of the Green Party, gather together the socialists in the Green Party and bring them out of that party. In fact, he's one step moving in that direction already, and that is to create a Green Left Canada. Is like a think tank policy advocacy current, which as socialists, we would be happy to join. But the point is to bring eco-socialists out of the Green Party, a bourgeois party, into the NDP or into an alliance with the Socialist Caucus of the NDP and with the rest of the left. John asked a great question. How could dissatisfied people be harnessed by an anti-capitalist party? Well, we can look at a recent election result in Norway. Last Monday, September 13th, the left bloc, which was led by the Labour Party in that country, won parliamentary elections in that Scandinavian country, defeating the 8-year-long right-wing government headed by a conservative prime minister. But interesting, I mean, outside of the bloc formed by the Labour Party and the Socialist Left and the Centre Party in Norway is another party that was not part of the bloc, not part of the coalition, that campaigned independently. And it's called the Red Party, ROD, R-O-D-T. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. I'm not Norwegian, but this Marxist party was really the biggest winner in the elections, increasing its representation in parliament in that country from 1 to 8 members. It wants Norway out of NATO. It advocates a classless society and a democratic revolution. The Red Party is anti-imperialist. So when are we going to have a Red Party in this country? Well, that's the $1 million question, and the answer is when the left is able to gain a mass base, particularly in the unions and in the NDP, it will be in a position not only to run in municipal elections, which Socialist Action is doing in a modest degree already, but for other levels of
Please
government.
wrap up.
And that requires base building. It means folks like the person who posed the question should join the Reds in Canada, the Socialist Action, and help us build that mass base. We are growing rapidly in the last 2 or 3 years compared to decades before. And I invite him and others to help us get past the threshold where the red option is a real one in
Thank you,
Canadian
Barry.
politics.
Okay, Sean?
Of course, now that my daughter's sleeping, I can answer questions probably a little easier. So how will you convince the NDP to start taking advantage of first past the post by working with the Greens? It's interesting. I ran in a riding where there was no Green candidate on the ballot, and I actually was able to connect to the local Green EDA and the potential candidate from that from our riding, and connect with a lot of the Green voters to vote for me. But I will say it wasn't something where 1 for 1, if you voted for Green, you were going to vote for me. Obviously, not everyone who aligns with the Greens aligns with the NDP and what they do. So it's really signaling with progressives overall. And I know if you watch any media coverage of the election, Justin Trudeau liked to say he was a progressive in nearly every other sentence, but as majority of us here will probably know, that's nothing could be further from the truth. So it is really trying to understand and draw a line in the sand as to what progressive means and what those types of values are for people's supports, so that when people use the word and believe that they're aligning themselves with someone who actually isn't doing progressive things, we know that we can put ourselves behind the people who are. And that's something I think we always need to continue working. Why is the Green Party a capitalist party, NDP bourgeois workers party? I mean, very, very eloquently handled why the Green Party is a capitalist party. And I actually will disagree with him on something with the NDP. I don't think the leadership of Jagmeet Singh and going left are at odds with each other. I think the two can still proceed forward together. I believe that we can push the party much further left, but that's going to come from bold policy choices. And that is something that I don't know where we can basically provide the roadmaps for those policy choices. Because right now, we get to an election, we have policy that we come through that is better than the Liberals, but it's not enough to really, I think, attract people into a much more strategic place of saying, this is where we're going to go. And it's much further, because I think we're afraid. We're afraid of making those bold non-capitalist stances for things like housing in particular, especially when people's values and their entire net worth are wrapped into housing. But right now, housing shouldn't be an investment, and it is an investment, and it's a primary investment. 20% of all housing is owned by corporations, and when that's what's going on, and they want the price to always increase, but it's a need people need to have, and so we need to start drawing that line in the sand. And one basic electoral question is how much electoral apathy of the working class and anger behind the PPC vote, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting, because I think what people need to be angry about is the systems that aren't working. And a lot of the problems with socialist causes is there's been a lot of bad media towards socialist causes. And what we need to do is say, hey, these are legitimate solutions that can be implemented in government to help ensure that you're going to have all the base supports you need for your health. You're going to be able to have dental care. You're going to be able to have eye care and pharmaceutical coverage. You're going to, when you go to purchase a house, it's not going to require 60 to 90% of your income, because we've created these other solutions that we can go down. And I think the anger that people have at the system and what's going on is because they don't feel they have enough. And when we're struggling, we align ourselves into anything and everything that we feel can put us into a better place. And sometimes it's the exact opposite of what will put us in a better place. But those emotions and those pressures are what radicalize us, sometimes in the wrong direction, sometimes in the right direction. And I think really where our strategy needs to be bold in this is by creating those roadmaps of solutions, because without them, people are just buying into, vague ideas. But if we really lay it out, and if we really plan it out with experts and show people that this is the best way to proceed forward, and we are able to effectively push it through grassroots movements, I think that's where our future lies.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Okay, back to our producer for 3 more questions.
Okay, our first question comes from Peg Joe. Question is, can NDP demand electoral reform citizens assembly whose recommendations are binding and laws passed to implement it? NDP votes went to Trudeau's fear-mongering even where it's cons NDP contest. And Todd Budney asks, what do we do about the rise of the PPC and the anti-vaccine rhetoric behind them? M. Gustafson asks, for MP Gazan, do you believe that the Communist Party of China is in the process of building socialism? What type of diplomatic relationship would you like to see between Canada and China?
Okay, well, for that question, of course, other people may want to answer. That's up to them. But I just want to once again remind our audience that our MP Gazan had to leave. So she is not here to answer questions. So anyway, but our lineup this time will be Barry, Sean, and Chris, and you have 4 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3 questions. So we'll start with Barry.
There we go. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'm seeing strange things on my screen, but that's okay. So if I understand correctly, the first question was, oh, it's written here in the chat. Can the NDP demand electoral reform citizen assembly whose recommendations are binding and laws passed to implement it? NDP votes went to Trudeau's fear-mongering, where it's a conservative NDP contest. Well, yes, the NDP should advocate a citizen assembly to make recommendations on electoral reform. And I believe a resolution to that effect carried at a common subcommittee with with all parties voting for it except the Conservatives and some Liberals, but it carried. But of course, with the rise of Parliament and the election, that died right there on the spot. But it's worth a try. A citizens' assembly to recommend would be good. Convincing the Liberals to support PR is a big challenge, but we may not see that until we have a workers' government, or at least an NDP government in Ottawa, but we need to advocate it. How to overcome the fear-mongering? Well, first of all, we have to be clear about the difference between the NDP and the other parties. If all you see is like a shade of difference in policy between one and the other, then it doesn't seem like there's much at stake, and you can advocate with that misunderstanding while support the party that's not quite so right-wing as the one that is farther to the right. But there's an institutional class fundamental difference between the NDP and the other parties, and that the NDP is a working class party linked to and based on working class institutions, and the other parties are tied to big money, even the Green Party, and that's a non-starter from the word go. So if there's greater clarity and consciousness is raised around this distinction, this class distinction between the parties, and also between the interests of working people and the interests of the state, which serves the landowning, industry-owning class, then we'd be much farther ahead and less likely to be spooked by these fears and the fear mongers. Anton asked, what do we do about the rise of the PPC and the anti-vaccine rhetoric behind it? It's important to educate, and it's important to advocate clearly in the interests of public health. And that means everyone should be required to to get 2 shots, 2 jabs of the vaccine, to be fully vaccinated if they're going to work with people indoors, if they're going to be in close proximity to other folks. It's very important that we follow the science on this and confront with the facts those who believe in conspiracy theories and who have unfounded notions about public health. Education is important, but it's also important to counter-demonstrate. When the PPE holds a rally or decides to picket, even if they're picketing a bourgeois politician like Justin Trudeau, the left and the unions should counter-demonstrate against the PPE and say that, no, you will not have this platform. We will challenge you. We will confront you with the facts. We will throw science in the face of conspiracy theorists and right-wingers and racists who are embraced by the PPC. It was particularly disgusting to see PPC supporters and anti-vaxxers campaigning, intimidating, heckling, trying to intimidate healthcare workers, nurses and doctors outside hospitals. That's where the labor movement should have been, in its hundreds and thousands, saying we're here to support our healthcare workers and to stand up against this verbose minority that is based on lies and fears. So counter-demonstrate. Andrea Horvath in Ontario said, well, let's pass a law in the Ontario legislature to create a safe zone around hospitals and similar institutions. Well, I'm not in favor of creating a law to ban those people, because that law will be used against the left when it comes to defending picket lines when there's a strike of workers whose rights have been ignored for a long time. So we don't need a law. We need to mobilize public opinion and mobilize people in action. Do I believe that China is in the process of building socialism? No. China is a capitalist regime. It has the largest number of billionaires in the world. It is building infrastructure around the world in which countries can't afford to pay for the construction, and then they become the owners of it. But we defend China's right to self-determination, and so we are against the anti-China lobby, the Cold War agitation against China. We say the 2 Michaels will be freed when Zhu will be released from house arrest, and Canada will stop capitulating to the Trump administration's demand for her extradition to Washington. That's what we argue.
Yes, I would hope that the next questions that everybody will keep to their time. Most people are, because we still have a whole lot of questions left and we want to get them all in. So if I give you 4 minutes, please stick to 4 minutes. Thank you. The next speaker is Ashant.
Thank you. For the NDP demand electoral reform citizens assembly. I mean, absolutely. As Barry said, it was killed as soon as Parliament was dissolved for the election itself. And doing so is really important. The hardest part about electoral reform in this is I know that the Liberal government is really in favor of instant runoff voting. And that is what I would describe as the second worst system after first past the post. It sounds like wonderful electoral reform, but it still provides very similar results and still doesn't actually give you the same kind of benefit as proportional representation. There are now proportional representation in itself is fantastic, but it's actually an older system. You know, there are more modern systems that exist that I would probably want to pursue instead, because if we're going to come up to date with the world, why don't we start leading it in far better forms of proportional representation, such as dual member, or there's actually many. Equal vote is a wonderful resource for that. They're a nonpartisan, like they don't have a particular one they want to push or pursue. I know, Maverick. I'm not a fan of first past the post either. Okay, so I think it's important to start pushing towards electoral reform, obviously. And what do we do with the rise of the PPC and anti-vaccine rhetoric behind them? You know, it is a hard question, because people should have, you know, the right to believe what they want, but the problem is they're believing a lot of falsehoods in this. I have lost a lot of friends who personally have fallen down a path where they say I muzzle my children because I have them wear masks to protect their health during a pandemic. And it's a very aggressive, unhealthy way of thinking at times. And the thing is, you can believe what you want, but I truly, truly believe that we need to make sure that people are further educated, have resources available, so that we're not into this divisiveness that goes on when it comes to anti-vaccination. I worked in a genetics lab when I was in university, where we first transcribed RNA into DNA and plotted out in the DNA microarray. And we'd worked with creating mRNA pathways for that. And everyone's saying this is untested technology. We've been doing this for decades. It's creating the proteins as opposed to having a dead viral shell. And this is proven technology. And it's just really strange rhetoric and marketing for some reason to create some kind of division. And I'm not entirely sure why it's even there at all in the first place. And I'm just gonna answer those first two because my son needs some attention, so I'll pass along.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, Chris?
All right. Yeah, I think I'll stick to the first two as well. I don't think I feel like tackling Sean right now. So can the NDP demand electoral reform, citizen assembly whose recommendation are binding and laws passed to implement it? NDP votes went to Trudeau's fear-mongering, even where it's a conservative versus NDP contest. All right. In the current parliament, I think the NDP is going to have a tough time getting any electoral reform stuff passed. I think they absolutely want to, and I'm sure we'll see lots of good bills put by really good NDP MPs on mixed member proportional representation, and just like Sean was talking about, I actually think you did make a pretty good point that it obviously we need to do something other than first past the post, but there's actually it's not just proportional representation. There's dozens of different things, and we really do need to have conversations about what's best. So yeah, I mean, the Liberals benefit more than anyone from first past the post. That's just the way it is. There's a reason why at one point when they were third place in Parliament, they promised they promised electoral reform, and then they broke that promise. They have no intention of ever doing it again, and they certainly are not going to be bullied by the NDP or anyone else into it. Not to mention, I think the Bloc has a lot to lose in any scenario where there's not proportional representation, and I don't think they'll ever sign on, but I don't know their position that well. It just seems to me that they exist in the capacity they do because of first past the post. But with that being said, a majority NDP government, I have no doubts would pass electoral reform. Not only is it in the best interest of the country, but it's in the best interest of the party as well. And then the second question, what do we do? Oh, sorry, I scrolled up. What do we do about the rise of the PPC and the anti-vaccine rhetoric behind them? I mean, I think a lot of people are doing the right thing about the anti-vaccine rhetoric. There's been a bit of a consolidation among the center and the left, heck, even the center right, about not letting anti-vaccine rhetoric stand. And I think that they're gonna, there's always gonna be anti-vaxxers when there's a pandemic. However, I think that'll only last so long. I wouldn't worry too much about right-wing populists unless if we don't have left-wing populists. You can't let your only populist be right-winger, because then you risk the 25 to 40% of the population that are populists will end up going to them in a big wave. So as long as we make sure to have a left-wing populist message, and I think there is, to an extent, I believe the NDP currently does that, but I think there's definitely more that they can do. I'll wrap up there.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so we're back to our producer for 3 more questions.
Okay, our first question comes from Alan Ramsey asking, what would your top 3 policies be for the NDP to push for the months ahead in the months ahead? The next question comes from Rob McDermott, who asked, when did the NDP lose the CCF's ties to farmers, chronically challenged, ties to food prices in a time of inflation, food insecurity environment? Tom Baker asks, it would seem the NDP party brass strategy of avoiding controversy and running a personality campaign failed miserably. What are the priorities for the NDP left moving forward?
Okay, so you each have 4 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3 questions, and we're going to start with Sean, then Barry, then Chris. Sean?
Sure. Sorry, just going to the first question. Top 3 priorities for the NDP to push ahead in the coming months. I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of things the NDP have been pushing for that the Liberals have claimed that they are doing or in the process of doing. That being pharmacare. I heard that we're starting pharmacare when they're giving $25 million to Nova Scotia over 4 years to bring it up to line with the rest of the provinces. That's not universal pharmacare. So there's a lot of like weird things that I think are going to be half attempted by the Liberal government to claim that they've done it and that the NDP is superfluous. But I think that's where we really need to push a lot bolder things. And one of them, I think the NDP needs to lean heavily into the climate. I think we need to be the climate leaders for the country. And I think there is a lot of people on the ground and the grassroots that are pushing that within the party itself. So I think, we got to really focus on the climate. I think it's one of the number 1 priorities because no one else is doing it with any weight in the House of Commons right now as it currently stands. 2, I think we need to switch over our housing priorities entirely. And I think we need to move beyond the building units and really thinking into how housing's allocated. I think if the party does that, it'll be unique, it'll be bold, and it'll ensure that it's not all through market means to provide housing for people, because it's proven just to be taken advantage of, especially in the cities. And then 3, I think one of the larger things that the NDP should really push for is decriminalization. I think they're the only voice for it right now in the House of Commons, and people are dying en masse. It's far worse than it ever has been. And this is the time to make it happen. And I think if they're bold to really make it a concession point, it's something that we can easily achieve. Next question is, when did the NDP lose CCF ties to farmers, chronically challenged ties, food prices in a time of inflation, social security environment? That's really interesting because I think I'm from Alberta, and I think rural Canada has somehow convinced themselves that the Conservatives are the people in favor for farmers, especially because there's a lot of mass farming. But really, I don't think the NDP ever really truly lost what they should, what should be the representation of rural Canada. There's just been a lot of interesting marketing, and I think we need to make sure that we say, as much as we stand for labor, that we do as the NDP, that we need to make sure that we push back to make sure rural Canada is part of that process. And the last question about the NDP party brass avoiding controversy, running personality campaign. Here's the thing. I support Jagmeet. I know a lot of people are taking this election as a reason to say, hey, we don't think he did a good job. As a candidate, Jagmeet personally reached out. He made sure that, I was able to communicate with him at a bit of a larger party that I never could before when I previously ran in 2019. I still trust him as a leader, but I think the priorities for the NDP going forward is, I think Jagmeet needs to take the will of the party, and that is to be more left and to be the voice for that. And I think combining his personality with strong policy is the way forward, and I think that will lead us to victory.
Thank you, Sean. Barry?
Well, thanks to Ellen for her question about the top 3 policies. It's hard to reduce it to 3, though, isn't it? But I'm going to try. And I'm going to say climate, reconciliation, and public ownership of the big landlords. So let me just elaborate on those. Climate, not a carbon tax. We don't need to modify consumer behavior. We need to modify production. We need to modify the behavior of the big producers, the big commodity producers, big business. We need to put constraints on business to not only reduce over packaging and stop producing planned obsolescence and stuff that is noxious and toxic to the population and to the environment, but to produce the things that we need and to stop, we need to take control of big gas and big oil and use their trillions of dollars of assets, not only to provide Indigenous communities with what they need and what they deserve for centuries, but we need to as well convert from carbon to green sustainable energy systems. We need to invest, and we can do that in Alberta and many other places where there will be workers who will lose employment because not only, well, the price of oil is falling. It's based on an old technology whose day is come and gone. But we need to create the energy systems for the future, and we can do that by using the wealth that has been leached out of the land and out of the lives of people to enrich a handful of families. In terms of reconciliation, well, I think that speaks to the issue of climate justice, because the stewards of the land for thousands of years are the people who have the most at stake and who have the worst social conditions. What about the housing question? I agree with Sean that it's not simply a matter of supply, but I would amend that slightly to say, we need to build more housing. We will need to, because the population is growing. There's immigration and new families that need housing, but there's a lot of empty housing. There's a lot of unoccupied flats, and the solution there is not a market solution. We need government action. We need a public solution. We need public ownership of the big landlords, those who are getting tax breaks just because they're evicting tenants and then making some changes to the appearance of the building, and then jacking up the rents for another set of tenants. So that has to end. Right now, the tax system actually promotes the rendering of many people to be houseless. We need to take control not only of the big landlord, but the land development and construction industry, and create cooperative housing, create housing that is geared to income, rent geared to income, and to use existing housing stock and to create new housing stock to meet the need, because there are many thousands of people who are without housing, and it's not just the people you see on the streets, but the people who are sleeping on somebody else's couch. This is a rich country, and there's just no excuse for the housing shortage and for the poor distribution of housing. I want to address a couple of points that Sean made, and with great respect. And I mean, this is an opportunity to debate, right? So when everyone thinks alike, nobody
30
thinks much.
seconds.
So we have a chance to debate. Can Jagmeet Singh go left? Well, I guess it's conceivable, but there's no evidence for it. Not only does Singh not go left on his own, but even when he's pushed, he blocks socialist candidates from being NDP candidates. He blocks policy debate at the convention, and he ignores policies that is adopted at the convention. For example, on Palestine, which took an enormous effort just to get the issue to the floor. After attempts for 4 conventions in a row, it adopted a 2-pronged policy: no arms trade, which he reluctantly expressed, and also no commercial relations with institutions on the occupied territories, which he's been silent. He refuses to articulate adopted policy. So if he's willing to go left, we need to see a sign of it. Sadly, I don't believe it, but if there's a strong left wing organized in the NDP, it's much more likely to force him advocate and enunciate adopted left-wing policy. We've got to drive that issue forward by organizing. So let's work together through the Socialist Caucus to make sure these issues are at the top of the convention agenda actually get to the floor, get debated, get adopted, and get implemented.
Chris?
Hi. All right. So I think I'll be really quick. So top 3 priorities for the NDP. One is going to be a climate solution. It has to be that broad because we're only talking 3 priorities. So it needs to be a fully fleshed out climate plan. And I liked our federal climate plan. In general, I think it was pretty well done. Obviously, I'd like to see a little bit more nationalization of heavy industry and the big polluters, because as we know, the most pollution doesn't come from you and I, it comes from big corporations. The second thing is going to be an affordability plan. So when looking at affordability, we need to be looking at incomes, finding a national plan to raise incomes as well as a national plan to lower expenses. And the biggest, I think, single expense that are hurting people right now is housing, and childcare is another one. And I actually do have a lot of hope for some progress on that in this parliament. I think the NDP are going to be able to push the Liberals to a better childcare plan, and they're going to be able to push them to a better affordable housing plan. And the third thing needs to be a policy that deals with the social and cultural issues surrounding our country. So that can be again how we deal with Indigenous affairs in the country, and making sure that we're dealing nation to nation in a fair way that's not lording over the people that we've colonized for hundreds of years. As well as, when I say a social plan, I mean dealing with the generational differences as well that we're seeing. There's no doubt in anyone's mind, I think at this point, that the millennials and Gen Z are a little bit different from the generations that came before, which happens every few generations. This happens, and we need to make sure that those people feel welcome to participate in politics. Going on to so those would be the 3 major platforms I think they need to focus on. NDP CCF's ties to farmers. I agree with Sean. I don't think they necessarily lost the ties to farmers. I think that due to a lot of organizational reasons, we struggle to get out to rural ridings. I can tell you, in New Brunswick, there's more opportunity in rural ridings than anywhere else, because sometimes I hear people complain about, oh, maybe there's not NDP signs in their urban ridings or whatever, but in these rural ridings, sometimes there's just nothing. You see a few conservative signs and that's it. So if we can get out there and we can empower grassroots activists to do that, this is a great opportunity, and that's how we start winning triple-digit seats in the House, I think. It would seem the NDP party brass of avoiding controversy and running a personality campaign failed. What are the priorities for the NDP left moving forward? I'd agree with that to an extent. I certainly don't think that we need to be running on a cult of personality. I don't think that's the right way for a leader to run a party. I don't. Some people on the left are pushing really, really hard, saying that maybe the leadership is the core issue. I don't care who the leader is for the most part. I do think that there's some improvements that need to be made, mostly around empowering grassroots members. I can tell you that I gave the federal NDP a list of names for people to collect signatures in all across New Brunswick in May, and they didn't tell me till a week before the deadline that they were failing to get those signatures in 4 ridings. So I had to run all across the province to make sure we had a full slate of candidates. And I don't think that's an ideological issue. I think that's an organizational issue. So we need to make sure that the party is able to reach out in areas they haven't been successful, so they can be successful in the future. And left-wing activists have the energy here. I see Sean and the energy that he's put into his campaign. Those are the types of people we need to empower. But I do want to say we can't be hesitant in being critical of the party. We need to work together at the end of the day. But if organizers are speaking out and saying that they didn't get the support they need, then they need to be listened to. It doesn't mean we need to all pull out our knives and like we're all on the same team here, but we do need to recognize how we need to change going forward.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so we're going back to our producer for the last 3 questions, and each panelist will have 4 minutes, please, 4 minutes. And we will start with Chris, then Sean, then Barry. Okay, Kurt, to questions, please.
Our first question comes from Victini Rishiram. His question is, how can representative voting be first past the post ensure marginalized and rural constituents have representation in Canadian Parliament? Our next question is, my question to all the panelists is this. Imagine Dimitri Lascaris had won the Greens and had represented a full slate of candidates with an eco-socialist program. What happens then? And our last question is, why does Justin Trudeau pretend to be progressive but act like a real capitalist?
Okay, we start with Chris, 4 minutes.
I'll do these in reverse order. Why does Justin Trudeau pretend to be progressive but act like a real capitalist? Because that helps him get elected. If it helped him get elected to be a capitalist but act like a progressive, that's what he'd do. He doesn't. He wants to get elected, and there's certain people he wants to help out. That's all there is to it. Politics sucks. Imagine Lascaris had won the Greens and had presented a full slate of candidates with an eco-socialist program. What happens then? I wouldn't count out the fact that if you have an eco-socialist candidate, there's not going to be Green turmoil in the Green Party. We have every reason to expect that the non-socialist wing of the Green Party has a greater lock on that party than the socialist wing. And so they probably would have dealt with much of the same turmoil. However, I do think that would have ended up pushing the NDP a little bit more left in some of their priorities. They could have, I definitely think they would have had a better election result. No, I don't think the Greens would have won 30 seats and really this be their breakout election. But it's, I don't know. I can't read. I can't read for sure what would happen. I think the Green Party has much the same as the NDP, has a number of issues they need to sort out. And while it does help who the leader is, the party is much bigger than any one leader. All these parties are going to likely be here long after the leader's gone, with maybe the exception of the Greens. They're in some trouble. So the final question, also the first question, this one was a little confusing to me. So how can representative voting be first past the post and ensure marginalized and rural communities have representation in Canadian Parliament? If that's the way the question was meant to be structured, I think that doesn't that doesn't work. That's why we have problems with first past the post. You can see that over 3 times as many, if you just divide the amount of seats by the amount of votes the party's got, the Liberals MPs have 3 times less votes than the average NDP MP, because like for every NDP MP, you get 118,000 people voted NDP. And for every Liberal MP, it's like 38,000. So those are the problems with first past the post, and they affect rural communities, they affect urban communities a ton. I think they affect rural communities more because it's just easier to campaign in urban communities. If you can go from one riding to the next in a 15-minute drive, you're going to do that. It means signs get seen by more people. And as soon as you switch some sort of other model, it could be MMP or something else that Sean was discussing, we're going to be in a much better spot to actually represent everyone fairly. Now, with that said, I think even with MMP or something else, we're going to have to fight to make sure rural voices are heard. I think no matter what, that's going to be an issue.
Thanks, Chris. Sean, 4 minutes.
I'm going to just continue on what Chris was saying about hearing rural voices, having grown up in Alberta. I actually will say one of the advantages to the pandemic right now is literally what we're doing right now. I'm having a Zoom conversation with people across the country, people I would never have traditionally interacted with. And I believe there's a lot of new techniques to allow those voices to communicate and band together. You know, I'm sure people viewed debates in this election because some of them were online via Zoom that had never been able to make it to a debate, be it because of accessibility, be it because of, just general childcare, travel, all these different reasons. And I think that is something where we need to start utilizing a mixed medium message so that we have things in person and we've got things online, because I think that's just the future, so everyone can actually have access. But I'm sure Chris covered all the rest of it I wanted to say about rural voices in that as well. So what happens if Dimitri had won the Greens and presented a full slate of candidates with an eco-socialist program? What happens? You know, it's funny. I do find myself, I align with a lot of what Dimitri says, but I will say I come from a labor background, and for me, the NDP have proven themselves over time to be the allies to labor, and I cannot say that of the Greens in general. And it would just have to be over time. I think Dimitri could very much align himself to gather progressives into, as what he's doing right now with a bit of this think tank with the Green Left. And I think there is a strong ability for us to put climate in the forefront of the NDP, so that we can make sure that everything that the Greens have been standing for the past 30 years, the NDP can go, well, you know what, we agree with you. This is super important to us, so we're going to put that in the forefront of what we're doing as well. And as Barry said earlier, it would end up making the Greens superfluous at that point, and hopefully we'd absolve all of the progressives into one area, because that's the only way we're ever going to get a progressive government that actually might get rid of first past the post in the first place. Which leads to the final question: why does Justin Trudeau pretend to be a progressive but act like a real capitalist? Well, as an Indigenous person, there's a lovely documentary. I know, Maverick. There's a lovely documentary I like to watch called Dancing Around the Table about Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and when they were producing all the agreements with the Indigenous people during the 1982, sorry. So my head's not in this. You know what? I'm just going to pass. See you guys later.
All right, Barry, 4 minutes.
Yeah, brother Sean, thank you so much for your contribution to the discussion. I know it's a challenge with a toddler, and we really appreciate all the effort you've made to engage in this dialogue, and we really value your input and look forward to working with you in the days ahead. I want to address the three questions that were posed. How to improve rural and racialized representation in Parliament? Parliament is a bourgeois institution. It's the legislative arm of the capitalist state. It's not designed to provide genuine representation of the interests of rural and racialized people. That's not its function. Its function is to co-opt the working class, rural and racialized people, women, LGBTQI folks, and all others who have a grievance with the system, who are oppressed and exploited by the system. So my preoccupation is not in getting more people, who hail from these discriminated and oppressed sections of the population into Parliament. I mean, it's better if they're there rather than Parliament being, an old white boys club. But I look in another direction, and that is to idle no more. I look to Black Lives Matter. I look to Me Too, the women's movement, standing up against violence. That's where we're going to build the new society, and that's where we're going to build the mass movements that will be capable of replacing minority rule in the so-called Parliament of the people with the rule of people in workers' councils that represent workers in the workplace, workers in the communities, workers among oppressed layers of the population. That's the future of democracy. It's a workers' democracy. It's always a class question when we face these issues of representation. Which class interest will be advanced? Not just the appearance of advancement, but actual, policies and economic action that corresponds to the interests of the vast majority. Secondly, what if Dimitri had won? Well, what if the cow did fly over the moon? I mean, it would be very interesting, but it's extremely unlikely. And I'll tell you why, because you can just see that thousands of people joined the Green Party just to vote for Dimitri. And I like Dimitri very much. And I had an exchange with him, a written exchange with him just before this meeting. And I said, what's your take on the election? He said, it was a disaster for the Green Party. And I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, well, Annemie Paul should have resigned on election night. Who knows when she will? And when she does, I'll decide what to do. But the fact is, of the thousands of people who joined the Green Party to vote for Dimitri, half or more of them quit after the election. They fled the party because they could see that the leader that was put in place didn't represent their interests and desires. So it's extremely unlikely. Even if Dimitri won the leadership of the Green Party would instantly split. I make this with confidence a prediction. It would instantly split. And then it would be a question of, the right-wing Greens would sail into the sunset with their pro-capitalist program, and the left-wing Greens would have to decide, are we going to build a party to compete with the NDP, or are we going to join with the socialists in the NDP? Because socialists and the working class are key to social transformation. As Sean said, we need the labor base, and we need to win the majority of working people who belong to unions and those who are trying to organize unions, those who just formed a union at Chapters Indigo in 5 stores, those who just unionized WestJet. There's union organizing happening, and they're not looking to the Green Party. So that's where we have to be. We have to be where the action is, and to bring folks together and acquaint them with a revolutionary program. Why does Trudeau pretend to be a progressive? Because the majority of the population is progressive, and he's a friggin' opportunist. And his family, his father was the same. And that's what they do in order to rule, to mislead us, to confound us, to confuse us, to feed us a lot of, horse manure. They treat us like mushrooms, keep us in the dark, fed, what. So that's the way they operate. And we have to counter that with clear class politics that are sharp. Even if some people are initially offended, they will come to see that when liberals break strikes and they impose austerity, although they put it under another name and they smile brightly while doing it, that our interests are shrinking. And young people are coming increasingly to the conclusion. Not only is the majority of the population progressive, a large layer of young workers are radical, are pro-socialist. Most opinion polls in Canada and the United States show that a majority of people under the age of 30 identify with socialism. They don't think that capitalism has a future. So we need to harness that energy and that optimism and that drive for fundamental social change, to put an end to war, to put an end to exploitation, to save the civilization and humanity from the ravages of capitalism, to save the environment, to create a new world, a new mode of production in harmony with nature, and putting at the center of it the interests of Indigenous people. That's what we need to do. That's what we can do if we work together. So join the Socialist Caucus, join the Workers' Action Movement, and join Socialist Action. Thank you very much.
Okay, a special thanks to all our panelists, Leah, Barry, Sean, and Chris, and of course to Kurt, our producer. So please consider being a supporter of the Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website, socialistaction.ca, www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write socialistactioncanada@gmail.com or give us a call at 647-986-1917. And once again, if you like this show, please subscribe to the SA YouTube channel. The next SA webcast will be on Thursday, September the 30th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, on the topic Back to School, Back to Crisis, featuring Grace Rowett of Queen's University and Averall Damija, University of Toronto, Leo of Leap at the University of Toronto, and others to be announced. So, in the meantime, please be safe, stay healthy, stay active. Bye for now.